Well, I want to welcome all of our Zoom friends to the artist talk for Le Dernier des Touristes. This exhibit by Sarah-Mecca Abdourahman, an emerging Somali Indian multidisciplinary artist based in Ottawa and Montreal, and Laurena Finéus, a Haitian visual artist, educator, and arts administrator specialized in paintings. This exhibition demonstrates rich, multifaceted perspectives through storytelling, reworking of historical documents, and personal familial archives, deepening understandings of what it means to be honestly rooted in Haitian and Somali Indian identity and history in so-called Canada. I would like to take this time to be so thankful and grateful for the Algonquin Nation. Gallery 101 honors and respects the original people of the territory we currently occupy, unceded and unsurrendered Anishinaabe Aki who have been living and working on this land since time immemorial. We are also so thankful for the funders who make our work here possible, the Canada Council, the OAC, City of Ottawa, and the Community Foundation. And also, I always like to thank Christina Corey, our administrator, who is the backbone behind most of the things we do here. Most importantly for this evening, we are so grateful to Laurena and Sarah-Mecca, who've collaborated and created this beautiful and powerful exhibit. We will hear from both of them and have some time for questions and chat at the end of their talks. We're also recording this talk, so if you want to turn your screen off, that would be just fine. Please mute yourself until the end of our discussion. And near the end, I will ask a question about the upcoming workshop. So now I'd like to turn it over to Laurena and Sarah-Mecca.
Thank you everybody for joining our talk today. I just want to give a quick thanks to the Gallery 101 and Laura and Christina. We're so happy that you guys provided us with this wonderful platform to tell our stories. And I guess we would start off by talking a bit how the show came to be. This has actually been in the works since the start of the pandemic, so about 2 years now. Lauren and I actually met through Instagram. We had been following each other for quite a bit before the pandemic, and I guess you could say we're kind of fans of each other. And then we finally started DMing each other, and we were talking about doing a show together, which we now named Le Dernier des Touristes. And we actually found Gallery 101's open call for an exhibition, and we sent in our application. We were so lucky to be accepted by the jury. And of course, with the pandemic, things got pushed back a little, but we were saying how it really worked in our favor because it gave us 2 years to really prepare for this show and to get to know each other, get to know each other's art practices. We were lucky to share a studio space together and also do the wonderful mural project at the Ottawa Art Gallery. And it gave us wonderful practice because essentially we were painting on the same canvas. So it also couldn't have come at the most perfect time because it's right before Laurena goes to Columbia in New York for her master's. And it's kind of poetic in a way because it was supposed to be our first show together. And now it's maybe one of the last for a little bit while we're away from Ottawa. So we're really happy to have you guys here and do a little walkthrough of our works as well.
Right. First of all, I'd also like to say a big thank you to the team at Gallery 101. So Christina and Laura for really allowing us to be able to really make our vision come to fruition, because as Sarah mentioned, we've been able to work with each other for the past 2 years in many, many ways, sharing a studio space, doing the mural together, doing diverse group shows together, but never really in the context where it's really come from us and from our own envisioning. And I feel in this way, any idea that we really brought to the table was really accepted and welcomed with so much warmth and so much flexibility as well. And we were able to create something that truly represents us and represents what we first envisioned when we started to talk about this show 2 years ago, essentially. And I also am so thankful for Sarah and for the past 2 years of us sharing so many conversations and really working alongside each other. I feel in those 2 years, we've been able to really blend our practices, not only in the way that we approach or process, but also in the way that we create, which is also kind of what attracted us to each other, I think, from the very beginning, with the way that our practices were so complementary to even begin with visually, but now there's so much in the way that we approach narration of painting and of just creating that is working so well and gracefully together. And I'm so happy to be able to do this show in such a way. So Le Dernier Touriste was really a response to a lot of the first conversations that both me and Sarah were having following the pandemic. Of course, I think there was this sense of a need for community and a need to really just talk about everything happening at that point of the void that we really were feeling around that time as well. And talking about Blackness, Black figuration in painting in so-called Canada, and really coming as well from a similar space as two young Black women that also just graduated in the midst of the first of the pandemic in 2020, and not really having a sense of what would come next, and really talking about all of these things in relation to both of our cultural backgrounds as well, just felt so enriching, and coming to terms with also this idea of how our countries of origins have been perceived time and time again through the media, filtering a lot of these of the images and of what we've kind of had to go through and learn through in academia, also about our own countries of origins and the way of approaching painting, I think is kind of what led us to Le Dernier Touriste. And essentially, it really came from for me after I read this poem by Kitley Myers, an Asian author of the same title, where she describes his tourist gaze and its constant search for an authentic, exotic experience, as she observes of the foreigner, and really them trying to validate their prejudices of their conception of the third world. And essentially how the tourist becomes a bit this metaphor for us, both me and Sarah, and also for Mars, of any type of outsiders. So that could be writers or photographers or anthropologists or anyone that really comes in contact with this other, and how their perceptions till now still have such an impact as to how the social and the political standing is still seen today. And really talking and creating an imagination, and really this project in itself that talks to our gaze in response to theirs. And this is how we really came to this idea of the oppositional gaze by bell hooks, and how she really talks to the, more specifically to Black women when they go, when they're in relation to cinema, and seeing, already knowing what kind of images that will be presented with, in terms of having to resist to those images, and having to create something to really protect ourselves against what we're going to be presented with. And in the same manner, me and Sarah have kind of developed a practice in which we have tools, and we have a lot of symbolism around how to really protect a lot of the content and her families and the communities that we portray in the works that we do. And it is a bit about all of this that kind of came to make Le Dernier Touriste. So essentially here you can see this is the first if the slide I'm not seeing. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So here's kind of just the overall first floor of the show. If you go to the next slide, here's more of the first floor from as soon as you get into it. And one of the first works, which is on the left here, is going to be Peralt's sightings. If you go to the next slide again, here you go. Birth of an Idol, which is essentially my work that is directly speaking to the American occupation of the 1930s of Haiti, and a lot of this idea again of the gaze and how we can use different, well, in my way, I really love to use and to collapse a lot of history in different ways visually by using this idea of the window looking into something. And here at the outside, which again, we're talking about the tourists, we're talking about the people that are coming into these spaces. I really have those American soldiers. And within, there's actually this very sacred site in Haiti that is called Sodo. And essentially, it's a pilgrimage site in which people, both Christians and also Vodou practicant, will go once a year as a way to really replenish and have this connection with this beautiful waterfall. And what has been kind of like the issue a lot with Haiti, but also a lot of these sites of third world countries or where, you know, Blackness is so over present, is that there's this over documentation in history that we've suffered from time and time again, and in ways in which that over documentation becomes the narrative and becomes the truth of the history behind a lot of what has happened in the past without much context, without much care behind it. And here we have essentially, if it would be any other type of sacred site around, there would be much more care behind how these images would be taken, as a lot of these people, of course, there's no consent in how they're going to be photographed and so on. So it's really examining this kind of relationship between the photographer and also the sacredness of the site, and having in the middle actually this figure, which is that of Charlemagne Peralt, which was actually the leader of the Cacos, which essentially were this guerrilla group that were fighting for their freedom when the Americans were occupying Haiti during those years. And after his death, what they decided to do was kind of just to parade him around the city on this door as a way to really tell people not to go against them, and as a way to really warn people in a way. But it had the complete opposite effect, where he kind of became this type of idol in a way, because it kind of looks like Jesus on the cross. And instead of becoming a martyr, he really became this type of idolized figure in history. And really understanding how history kind of has that different duality depending on which community looks at it has been really my main way of exploring this work as the entrance piece for the show. And yes, this is essentially what this work is.
Yeah,
So,
I really, that's a beautiful explanation. I really love how you talk about this over documentation of our countries, and essentially you're starting the show off with this painting because essentially that's what our show is talking about, how we're often just portrayed in all this over documentation in one-dimensional lens. It's so hard to find our actual stories, and this is a great large painting to start off the show. So if you go on to the next slide. So for this painting is titled Mundane as oops, sorry, I did a typo, but mundane as my sheath. And essentially for my works, what we wanted to showcase in this exhibition is to end this era of exoticism. And to do this, I wanted to display the different aspects of my identity, but especially the stories that have not been heard or the ones that are really underrepresented. And this first painting that mirrors Laurena's first painting which is titled Mundane as My Sheath. And sheath is a Somali word that my family uses, but you could also call it a bati. And essentially it's home clothes that women wear. It's a big and long dress, basically. And for this painting, I wanted to use the sheath as symbolism for the mundane or Black ordinary life. So, so that's why the woman in the center, it can be seen wearing a sheath. And I wanted to demonstrate that there's really value in depicting Black ordinary life. Too often, Black representation is rooted in trauma or struggle. And I've always treasured these scenes of just family members relaxing in the living room or just simply existing. And painting Black figures simply existing is radical in a sense because of how ordinary it is. And it really contrasts this media portrayal that is always seen through the lens of struggle, and always these stories that are one-dimensional. So to go against this media or film or television representation, I wanted to create my canvas on that HD 16:9 ratio, which is essentially 1080 by 1920. So most of my paintings reference film ratios, either HD, so in this case it's the HD ratio, to really contrast and reference this lack of representation of Black ordinary life. And in my work also, family and memory has an important role as well. So each person is taken from my family photo albums. Each of my paintings are essentially a digital collage that I've done on Photoshop. And I've created my own scene and my own scenario. And I'd say I'd like to use these absurd colors or obvious, almost collage-like cutouts referencing my digital collage to really address my own memories or sense of nostalgia, even memories or lack of memories towards these people or even settings. And that's really what I tried to do here. So for this case, rather than portraying, in some of my paintings, I portrayed specific moments in history, but this is, I thought it was really important to me to portray just the mundane and Black ordinary life.
Right. And I really, as I've told you time and time again, I feel that this painting really allows us to kind of come in. It really invites us, as so many of your works do, is just the way in which a lot of these spaces and these communities are kind of taken away and again taken away from their context. And I feel like again here it really brings it down to this humane really space that you are able to create through each of your works, and really admire that from you in that sense. So next slide. Oh, awesome. So Decadent Terror, Badass Soleil. So essentially in this work, I'll start with this quote. I believe it's Audre Lorde, but I might be wrong, which is, "You cannot dismantle the master's house with the master's tools." And something that has been time and time again, very implicit in the way that a lot of the colonial times, in the way that, again, the other has had so much impact on the way in which we're still functioning now, is how looking at those really working from the top, so the rich, the people that are really having a lot of, that are really creating the power imbalances in Haiti, and they're really taking advantage of the flawed system that we currently have, are kind of copying a lot of the tools and a lot of the ways in which we've had to live under colonial rule and so on. And that has been seen time and time again throughout history, when we had even a king really trying to replicate the British Empire, as a way to show power, even though that also didn't really work out because, again, we're talking about a totally different kind of setting and cultural tools really in terms of Haiti and the country itself. But here, what really inspired this work was actually the different UN missions that have been ongoing in Haiti, where they've been trying to stabilize one of the country's biggest slum, which is Cité Soleil. And there's also, it's really known for its multiple gang violence incidents and so on. But most of the time, it's not really helping the country or those spaces in the way that it needs to by responding violence with violence and just really resulting in more type of civil type of hurting and without really coming into the communities with structures that will last afterwards. So it really made me think about what would happen if these type of structures and higher powers such as the UN really were able to give help in a way that was really structured to the way the country needs it or the way the community needs it the most. And I felt in a way that it would have, instead of surveilling those really at the bottom, such as Cité and other slums like this around Haiti, really looking over the rich and having this kind of surveillance of the rich and of those that are really creating much of the havoc that people that are at the bottom of this pyramid are suffering from in Haiti. And this is where a lot of the references comes from in terms of the dancing. So these are actually images of a ballad that happened around the 1970s when we still had the dictator in Haiti by the Duvaliers, and when there was apparent ways in which the riches of the country were just being mishandled, and there was this clear black and white type of separation between the rich and the poor, which is still the case, but around that time it was even more clearer due to the dictator. And having these kind of men from the outside looking into, which the window is actually a reference to a Canadian painter, James Wilson Morris, and much of his voyage around the world, including the Caribbean, which he did a lot of paintings of Cuban scenes. And one of his paintings has this beautiful scene of two gorgeous windows and then this coffee scene. And this is kind of what I saw looking at his painting, is just a bit this direct idea of being able to look in and out. And I felt that in this way, there could be a direct kind of relationship between the person that's looking outside and inside. And this is kind of where came the idea of having those UN soldiers looking onto these rich people living and of course abusing much of the people's money and goods and so on. And the man in white that is kind of centered in this piece is really acting as witness to much of these histories and to much of this dismay that has been ongoing for so many years, which I think is also really needed in the way that history is being produced. There's no one really, when we think about it, it's if we think about it, it's really just fiction or taking someone's word for what it is. And it's just been for me a way to have these kind of characters or these kind of cues around in the painting as a way to just witness a lot of my play around historicity and how I work with really putting different parts of and different times together as a way to recreate and as a way to really assemble a true history of Haiti that really represents it to someone that may come from the outside, so they can understand all of its complicated but also very rich role in North America, and in how it has shifted a lot of the perspectives and perceptions of Blackness here, and of the Black migrant and so on. So this is a bit what this work kind of brings forward.
And I really love how, since with our show, we're really talking about the tourists and the effects and the roles of the tourists and how you've physically incorporated them in your paintings, but especially with this where you have like a witness kind of staring back at the audience. So it's almost like they're staring at the viewer or at the tourist, in a way to kind of address their own biases maybe. But I just really love that witness figure you have staring back at us. But if we go to the next slide. So I have these two paintings here. I have the large painting titled Manahe, which essentially means no mercy in English. And this was actually titled after a book that my grandfather published. And this main thing that he wanted to say was that he summarized was he wanted to reveal the actual truth, the truth of this so-called successful government, which was when Djibouti was under France's colonial rule. So in this book, he writes from the 1930s to the 50s and the 70s, and he's really talking about his involvement in Djibouti's history, fighting for independence. As one of the founding members of the people fighting for independence in Djibouti, and they were part of the African movement, which was at the time where a bunch of African countries were fighting for their independence from from colonization. And what I really wanted to use, I wanted to use basically his storytelling as a form of oppositional gaze, because still till this day, the story of how Djibouti fought for their independence has still been censored by the Djibouti government, but also by France's government. And when I was talking, I used a lot of oral storytelling to learn more about my history, since it is such a large form of Somali tradition through poetry and family tradition. And I did read the book, but I needed a lot of my dad's help to further understand my grandfather's readings. And what he was really saying was that France is still kind of there, and Djibouti is independent, but they still are slightly controlled by France, or still slightly working together. And that's how it is for a lot of our countries that have been under colonization. We have the title of independence, but we're not fully independent. So with this painting, it really tells the story, or culminating moments that my grandfather had written about. And one of the things that I remember the most was around in the 1950s, France had first proposed this idea of independence, but it was more of a manipulative question. They were expecting for people to say no. And my grandfather, along with Mahmoud Harbi, which is another famous Djiboutian independence leader, they were both fighting for the yes, which is the we. So when I was going through my grandfather's book, I found this. I essentially painted the same illustration, which is people in the city, and you see helicopters, army like planes, and the France military on top of these houses. And I just wanted to tell my grandfather's story, or his perspective of how he fought for independence. I had also remember reading that at the time, as I mentioned, oral storytelling is such a large part of our history. And he had mentioned that a large part of the population, or some of the population, was illiterate. So they had to do much of their campaigning mostly just orally. And I had read there would be a lot of graffiti with no, since the French were trying to convince everyone that they didn't want for independence, and they were part of the people that were fighting for this independence. And yeah, so that's essentially what I wanted to tell, his story, because so often when we look at our country's history, it's often written by the other, or by essentially the tourist. And it's really difficult finding our history written by our own people. And I found that I was really lucky to finally get to read this book and learn about my history through my grandfather's perspective. And that's why I painted him side by side. So this painting is titled Awowo. So that's what that means, grandfather, in English. And this is basically one of the only paintings where I directly painted from a photograph. And which is ironic in a way, is because I like to portray, I like to use this vibrant sense of color or even blurriness to relate to my own memories. And since I hadn't met him really, I don't really have any recollection of meeting him. So I don't have much memories of him. So I painted him that way, but actually the photo is just as blurry as that. So I didn't really change anything except for the vibrancy and the green colors. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say for these paintings, as a form of an oppositional gaze against how our countries are often written about.
That's amazing. I think it's one of my favorite works from the show, just because of how much depth and the way that you're able to really honor your grandfather in such a way. I think is so wonderful that we get to do this as artists, and to be able to really connect so deeply with those histories through the works that we do. So I really commend you for that, in the way that you've been working and thinking so deeply um, about your family and about this history. So just next slide. Oh, awesome, thank you. So as you were mentioning a bit, this idea of how we've been dealing a lot with having to filter a lot of the writings around our countries of origins, and understanding them, and truly taking in a lot of this, that it is through academia, through media, through even personal writings as well, trying to create our own understandings of those, I think come with a lot of weight, especially as painters. We're also dealing with a lot of imagery, a lot of violent imagery, sometimes less violent, happy moments. Collecting is a big part of my practice, as I do a lot of collaging before even painting. And I feel in a sense, there's been, as I've mentioned before, an over documentation of 80, that it is written or really just visual as well, without much care attached to it. There's this actual essay that I had stumbled upon. I don't exactly recall who wrote it, but essentially this is where the title of the piece came from, Blood Writings, referencing just a lot of the writing around 80, which has just been really wrongful and purposely wrongful, because again, of the role in which Haiti has just played as the first Black nation in the New World, and what it meant for a lot of the European powers of the time, of having some kind of leader to other, colonial powers at the time. What would it mean to have a Black nation that, could lead itself and could propel itself into reality on its own 2 feet? And it can be seen by just how many other revolutions kind of came after the Revolution of 80 in 1804. And after as well, just how much writing and how much heinous perspectives have kind of came and birthed itself from that moment. But it really became even more obvious after the American occupation, which is why it was the first kind of like entry point for me, when I started to really look at the different instances of 80 and this other. So, we began with the American occupation, but also now the UN. And this work is kind of just me working a lot with the overall grotesqueness of a lot of the imagery and that has been attached to 80, which is often related to the religious aspect of the country, which is a Christian, but also a voodoo practicing country, really equally, where you'll have as many Christian people as you'll have voodooism, practicing voodooisms. And essentially in this work, you'll see that there's this very strange theme of the masking, which I do use a lot of mask in my works as a way to reference carnival culture, which is really important in Haiti and just in the Caribbean in general as well. But in this work, it is kind of masking, referencing this book called Black Magical Island, written by James Seabrook around the 1930s, which was this American that went to Haiti to kind of experience for the first time a voodoo practice, a ritual for the first time, and kind of came back and created this really bizarre and again grotesque type of book around his experience, which was kind of like over sexualized, and was also the reasoning behind the zombie and Hollywood kind of creating the zombie around that time as well. And just understanding how that also builds kind of like an imagination around Haiti, and that's kind of like the history that has been left from that. So really in that book, there's actually a lot of illustrations that are meant to illustrate the people that were part of that ritual. But it doesn't really look very humane in the way that the faces or in the way that the bodies are done. So I would, say if you want to look it up, that's totally your thing to do, but it's a bit bizarre, but definitely interesting just to see visually. And just kind of reusing these images as a way to create this epitome of like the imagination around Haiti that has been built, and trying to counter that. So you have of course, the chef in the middle, and kind of what he's really bringing to the table. What is he bringing us in terms as the audience, taking in these stories and everything that's kind of been built around it. And in the middle, I think, which is like the main theme here, is really this siren, this mermaid figure, which is actually a reference to one of the lois in the voodoo culture. So a loi is kind of just like a spirit type of deity in voodoo, and essentially all voodoo deities are kind of very dual in the way that they have to be approached, in a sense that they're neither negative or positive. It really depends on the intention of the person that is, coming in term with them. And I feel in the same way that the history of Haiti and how it's been approached and perceived has like been very flattened. I kind of wanted to just have this deity, which is La Sirène in the middle, which is actually used as a way to look over any type of migrant kind of crossing over seas. And that's kind of, she has this type of motherly figure to her as well. And to kind of have her centered there as a way to counter a lot of what's happening back there, and a lot of the other narrative, and a lot of what's being presented to us in this meal that is constructed by this chef here, which is just a bit of a metaphor for just the history and that's been wrongfully created so far around Haiti, and just in a sense, it is kind of what is shown here.
Yeah, I really love your use of symbolism and metaphors, especially in this painting, even with the title, like a lot of writings, or the chef, that's the person creating, orchestrating these writings, and the mermaid. It's just a really, really beautiful painting. If we could go to the next slide. Oh yes, so this is basically our second floor. for the show. And if we could go to the next slide again. Okay, so this is one of the first two paintings that you see when you walk up into the show. As you can see in the last picture, it's kind of suspended with fish wire against the railing. So this painting is titled No Mercy, and this is actually the English translation of my last painting, which was downstairs, which is titled Manahe in Somali. So I thought it was important to name this the English version because I also wanted to do kind of mirror it in the sense that this is still really about colonial rule and France's colonial rule, or even Britain and Italy towards Somalia. And when making this painting, I was really thinking about this form of erasure towards our countries of origin. When we search images, it's so difficult to find images other than violence or some kind of terror. And even till this day, when I try to find beautiful landscape pieces, it's still so difficult. So I kind of wanted to depict this as a way to maybe depict what the past could have looked like prior to the war or to colonization, and what the future may still hold. And what I was really thinking about when making this was, whenever I used to ask like my dad or my aunt, how did Somalia or Djibouti used to look like before like the colonization? And from what I remember, I always remember them saying, oh, you'll never believe it. It was so beautiful, and it was so green. So that's why I really wanted to use a lot of green, and in a way as an oppositional gaze, to showcase all these vibrant and beautiful colors to contrast the dull and I guess sad colors that you see so often on Google Images when you just look up Somalia or Djibouti. And another thing that I was thinking about when creating this was one of the second times that I could recollect when I went to Somalia, we did a road trip to this place called Girato. And I guess even as a child at the time, I still had my own biases. I guess in a way, I was also a tourist entering my country with these kind of biases. And when we came to this place, I was so shocked of how beautiful it could be. And something that my aunt always repeats that I said as a kid was, I had mentioned, oh, this is so beautiful. It literally looks like how paradise is depicted in movies, because that's truly how beautiful I thought it was. And because there was like ponds of mineral water, waterfalls. I mean, you could dig in the ground and instantly you would see water. And we were all just not my aunt, but at least my cousins and I, we were so shocked by how beautiful the landscape was. And this is, I guess, maybe one of those areas that have been kind of untouched by the war, since till this day, there are still a lot of landmines that you can encounter when hiking. And I guess that's one of those untouched places. And ironically, even still to this day, I can't even find images of this place. And the one time I did find images of this place, it was on this kind of forum of people complaining, oh, how come these people have access to this land? They don't deserve this. So I just really wanted to create my own imagery to go against this form of erasure, to showcase how I see Somalia, or how I hope for it to even look in the future. So that's why I painted myself and my brother as diaspora, connecting with our own homeland. And I thought it was important for me to paint camels as well, since I was asking my dad and my aunt, and they had mentioned that camels was kind of like a symbolism of a unified Somalia, so a unified Somalia of all 5 territories. And as you can see, there's a bit of like black and white background in the back, and this is actually an illustrative archive of a really old town called Zayla. And this town basically has a lot of history, Somali history, but especially Islamic history. And I wanted to kind of set the background in a space where before there were any biases attached to Somalia. And that's essentially what I tried to do here. So I basically, painted me and my brother kind of standing in front of this landscape and trying to connect with it. And yeah.
Amazing. Again, really love this work. And in the same way, if we could go to the next slide. If we could go, thank you. So as you're just talking about land and this idea of paradise, and really land that has been untouched. I think this piece here, Nous déjà gain cassave, nous déjà gain café, which essentially translates to we already have cassava, we already have coffee, which cassava is some kind of dry type of bread in Haiti that is usually eaten with coffee as breakfast. And it was just something said by a lot of the protesters that were living on the island of Cow Island, Île Vache, which essentially is a bit outside a region that is a bit outside of Haiti, that is far enough that it's not really touched by a lot of the natural disasters that the island suffers most of the time, or a lot of the political or any kind of gang violence. It's a bit of this paradisiac type of space that oftentimes people will see and think it's untouched and needs to be, of course, profited from. And essentially what you see here is a bit the meeting between what is the villagers of Cow Island, which is a bit of play, again, with this idea of the carnival, the masking culture with the mask that they're wearing, and this one tourist white woman on one side, and the different perspectives of the world. So you have the Cow Island as it is, Île Vache as it is on one side, and then Île Vache as is what people are trying to develop and create or recreate it to be, and as a way to bring in all these other forms of income, saying, and really displacing a lot of these villagers at the same time. So all of this happening very recently in 2014, displacing people that have lived there for just many, many years. And the touristic culture in Haiti, just if we talked about Labadie, which is like this big cruise ship on kind of like little island, living a bit outside of Haiti, but also so close, and this kind of paradise that is built next to, shambles in its own ways, is always such an interesting, drastic contrast that I was really trying to explore here and to look into, particularly for this piece, talking most specifically to the situation of Île Vache, and essentially here, as they're wearing this cow mask and inviting this woman to also wear it as well, it's a bit of reference to the way in which when we're talking of carnival culture and masking in general, it's really a way to really strip down all type of status or any kind of concept of an individual, which I feel when we're just really all coming into these costumes and walking down the streets, it's just about community and coming together. And Edouard Chantica, which is this Asian author, has written just about this idea of how carnival culture is a bit this idea of rebirth, as well as you're reinventing yourself by wearing these costumes. And I felt that a lot of the times when people are coming into these spaces like Haiti, or are trying to develop Haiti to become and model it as to become something that doesn't exactly really do well for the country or for the people there. It really just lacks a bit this contact with the community there, and essentially what would happen if they were to come together and just have a conversation on common ground. And this is a bit what is alluded to here with the meeting of the two, and the mask coming in play.
And you have a really beautiful or very powerful moment actually in the center, where the roles are kind of switched, where the tourist becomes the other here, and you have the person touching this tourist face. I find it's so powerful because so often we think it's usually that when we're over here, the roles are reversed and they're always trying to touch us. But I really love how this person becomes the other, and you've done this kind of oppositional gaze in a way. If we can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is my last painting for the show. So this is titled It Is and It Isn't My Home. And for this painting particularly, I wanted to really tell my own story and my own perspective. As diaspora and first generation Canadian, or even children of immigrant parents, specifically my relationship to home and this idea of the third space. And the third space is essentially where neither home can really feel like home. Over here in Canada, it doesn't necessarily feel like home, and you still feel like a tourist or an outsider back home. And I found this wonderful citation from a poet named Warsan Shire, and her poem is titled Home. And what she writes here that I had written in my painting is, no one leaves home unless home chases you. And I really wanted to, I guess, depict this aspect of migration, which is not often talked about. I guess when over here, when we think about people coming to Canada or America, so often people think, oh, they're just coming for, I guess, for opportunities in Canada. But it's really that we've been chased out of our homes because these tourists come to our countries and they essentially ruin it with war and colonization, to the point where we need to seek home elsewhere. So I wanted to paint myself as diaspora, really just trying to connect with my home, but also showcasing the different perspectives. There's also my grandfather who migrated here to Canada for reasons of, I guess, violence as well. And he came here, but from what I always remember, he was so proud of being Canadian, because every time we had to think of gifts to give him, he'd always want merch with Canada written on it, or different provinces of Canada whenever we visited different cities in Canada. And he was always so proud of his, I guess he was always so proud of his Canadian citizenship. So that was really the duality in our stories that I wanted to showcase over here. And I tried to showcase that, I guess, in some of the expressions, in both of our expressions. And there are nuanced, we have nuanced experiences as diaspora. There isn't really one way of seeing home or experiencing home or a new home. But this was kind of my experience of trying to find home, and I wanted to showcase that here.
Yeah, and I think what really struck me the most with this work was just the very visible change in the expressions between yours and your grandfather's. And I truly feel there's a bit of like almost this uncomfort that comes with your expression here. And then as you were detailing just how proud your grandfather was of his Canadian status and so on, I think it also describes a lot of this choice that doesn't always happen between first and second generation of immigrants that are born here and not really having full footing back home, right? And then being here and just living and always have lived in a state of confusion, of hybridity, and having to kind of make do with that and understanding what that means, even if it comes like, especially from within, even as a child. So I think that's just so interesting to see the contrast here, as you're really good at portraying that. So next slide, and also last slide as well, which is Le Jardin de ma Candale. Essentially in this work here, what I'm really exploring is, again, this idea of land and how land really has a memory in terms as to who gets to get in touch with it, and which any type of outsider or any kind of person coming into these other spaces really leaves type of traces and behind that stay till now. And I think particularly in this particular site, which is Le Parc des Martissans, so the Martissans Park now, and before that it was a hotel which was occupied, well, not occupied, but which was a hotel done by Catherine Dunham this African-American dancer, which was this really decadent and rich hotel lifestyle where even the Clintons, I believe, did their honeymoon there, and then kind of just went to ruins a bit after the 80s or so, and became now this public site where there's a lot of fruits and flowers, and it really just is open to the public now. But before Catherine, there was actually Pauline Bonaparte and her husband that lived there, Pauline being, of course, the sister of Napoleon Bonaparte, and those colonial times. So that was their residency there before, and seeing how this site has kind of changed time and time again, but has managed to come back to the public and come back to a state of just full fruition as the way that it is now. It's kind of like what I wanted to showcase here. And the figure in the middle is actually a maroon, which during the time of our independence in 1804 or so, they were really just a group of people that even before even before there was a resistance, they were really the first ones trying to fight for an independence that many didn't even know that they were looking towards. And him as a leader and kind of this type of resilience of the land and of the country and of the people living there is kind of what this piece is meant to showcase here.
Yes, I really love how you really display the nuanced perspectives in this painting, as we were saying, that the tourist really could be anybody, diaspora or outsider, and they're not always necessarily bad. They could also add things to the country or some kind of positivity. So this is a beautiful piece to showcase that nuance.
Right, and really happy to have been able to host this talk with you, Sarah.
Yes, me
I
too.
believe, yeah, I feel now we're gonna get into questions, I believe.